introduce Mark Winfield. He's a professor at York University in the Environment and Urban Change Department. He's an expert in energy measures and in issues in Ontario. And he has written many articles, chapters, and been consulted by various committees. And he's been, let's say, he's been questioning some of the decisions and policies of the Ford government in Ontario. This includes some of the policies when they took office. As you probably recall, Ontario and the Doug Ford government got out of the agreement with California and Quebec to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not just in Ontario, but in North America. That's what that implied. And also he did a lot of cutting of funding to environmental renewable projects and so on. So more recently, he's been critical of the push for having natural gas in power plants in Ontario. And obviously, I won't go into detail, but you know the details. If we have fossil fuel production of electricity, it means more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Not a big thing to think about. But also, he's especially relevant to our talk and meeting tonight and some of the work that has been happening in Northern Ontario in recent times. That's his research and comments on nuclear power, both in Canada and certainly Ontario, where we have the most in Canada. So he points out that nuclear power is so different from other ways of producing electricity and energy. You can't fashion nuclear weapons from a solar panel and things like that. He's also pointed out specifically about nuclear waste that in fact it creates a toxic screen, and so far in our world history, I'm being a little facetious here, we've never had this kind of situation before, where we have nuclear waste being generated, a problem that we don't have the technology yet to solve, and so on. So I've left out quite a bit, especially knowing more about his background with Lake Superior from dinner a couple of hours ago. But I think I'll hand it over, and I hope Mark can fill in some of the details and elaborate on some of the work he's been doing. And I'll hand it over. Mark, take over.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks for the invitation. I don't know if I need the mic. Can people hear if I'm just speaking this way? No. Okay. Bad acoustics. There we go. All right. So in approaching this question, when Graham approached me, it was asking this question around nuclear energy and sustainability, and that requires some thought about how do we define sustainability to begin with, to answer this question about is this a sustainable energy solution. And nuclear is a particularly interesting case in this regard, in the sense that it's kind of the poster child for why you have to take life cycle perspectives on things. Because at the site of generation, the nuclear power plants, nuclear looks, at least in normal circumstances, relatively clean, and indeed plays on that very strongly. But if you look up and downstream in the fuel cycle, you discover that this is actually a remarkably dirty energy source. Both in terms of the uranium mining and milling operations, in Elliott Lake and other places, the legacies there. But then also this question of these downstream waste streams which according to the NWMO itself will require management on timescales of 1 million years. There's not a lot of other human activities that have the ability to produce that kind of a waste stream. And approaching this question of sustainability, I'm looking at it through a framework that we sort of developed for the purpose of a book I did published this fall with UBC Press called Sustainable Energy Transitions in Canada. And this sort of provided the normative framework for how we approach this in terms of 9 principles of sustainability. I can happily say this is not a plug to buy the book because we made it open access on the UBC Press website. So if people want to have a look there and download it, they can do that if they're so inclined. In the sort of larger context, we sort of see decarbonization, so my co-author and I are decarbonization is sort of a subcategory of the broader question of sustainability in terms of intergenerational justice, justice as a presence, democratic governance, avoidance of catastrophic event risks, and contributions to global security. And indeed, energy is a subcategory of decarbonization, and electrification is a subcategory of that. We need to keep that framework in mind when thinking about this, because we want to find pathways to decarbonization that don't cause negative trade-offs in other dimensions of sustainability, which in the case of nuclear energy is a very, very significant risk. A little bit of background on nuclear in Canada. We have 3 operating power plants in Ontario at Bruce, Darlington, and Pickering. There is one other operating reactor in Canada, power reactor, which is a Pointe-le-Croix in New Brunswick. There were 2 reactors at Gentilly in Quebec, but they have been closed. In fact, they were closed more than a decade ago. And then if we look at this in a sort of larger life cycle kind of perspective, uranium mining occurs in northern Saskatchewan. There is a refinery at Blind River. Laura and I passed it on the way up here in the airplane. We sort of saw it out the window, sort of. There is a further processing facility at Port Hope, which you ever ride the train between Toronto and Kingston, you will see very prominently. And then the actual fuel fabrication for CANDU reactors happens in Peterborough at Toronto. So that's sort of the upstream part of the fuel cycle. Ontario is sort of overwhelmingly the focal point. As of last year, nuclear provided just over 50% of the electricity supply in Ontario. By comparison, hydro is about 25%. Non-hydro renewables are running around 11 to 12% now, which is some significant change from where we were. Natural gas is about 10% of energy production these days, but that is, as Graham hinted at, is on a dramatic upswing. Is heading towards being about 25% of electricity generation. So we're on track as a result of that to about an 8-fold increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector relative to where we were at the time of the coal phase out in 2017. And the relationship to the gas component and the nuclear component are closely related, because the reason we're having to run up gas so dramatically is that most of the existing fleet of nuclear reactors in Ontario is at end of life and is in the process of being taken out of service, theoretically temporarily, for refurbishment to be brought back into service in the 2030s and the 2040s. And effectively, we're running gas to make up for that missing power in the short term. As I said, it's very important to take a life cycle perspective on nuclear, because there are very significant impacts, both upstream and downstream, from the point of energy generation. It's also important to keep in mind that Canada is the world's 2nd largest producer of uranium. About 85% of the uranium that's mined in Canada is actually exported. We only use about 15% for domestic fuel production to run the CANDUs, principally here in Ontario, and then the one unit in New Brunswick. In thinking, I'm going to skip ahead there a little bit. So, just in the interest of time, we'll come back to more theoretical discussions on sustainability further on, maybe. If we look at nuclear in a sustainability context, it does on the surface offer certain potential advantages. It is a very relatively low greenhouse gas emission source of energy, certainly relative to fossil fuels. This is a study that's done by the University of Sydney. It's done 20 years ago, but very little has actually changed in terms of the technology. And in greenhouse gas terms, nuclear does come out in roughly the same sort of space as renewables, even on a life cycle basis. It does potentially offer a large energy output. It is a low geopolitical risk fuel supply from Canada's perspective, and that was part of the reason why the development of a nuclear industry was originally pursued by Ontario and Canada in the 1950s and 1960s, was the uranium mines were in Canada, in northern Ontario and in Saskatchewan, which first seemed to be low geopolitical risk sources of the fuel. Probably true. Relatively low operating costs, if you're looking strictly at the operating costs and not capital costs. That's another question altogether. There was a notion that there was the potential to grow a domestic nuclear industry. I think there's lots of doubts about that. I mean, we had notions we were going to sell CANDUs to everybody, and in the end we sold CANDUs to Ceausescu and military juntas in Argentina and South Korea under a very large ethical cloud. And there is some potential for high-value employment in remote areas, of flying over the Bruce Peninsula and Tiverton. You know, that's very clear in terms of economic activity there. The mines in northern Saskatchewan, to some degree, are a similar story, although also raise huge questions around relations with Indigenous peoples. Against this, so this is sort of looking at the sort of upside. Why would you consider nuclear? We've got a range of negative trade-offs. There's the one that we're talking about right now, but more broadly, there are very, very significant non-greenhouse gas environmental and health impacts, especially upstream, particularly associated with uranium mining and milling. And we are presented in the star of the show around here these days with this problem also of extremely long-lived waste streams that require effectively perpetual care for safety, environmental, and security reasons. As I mentioned before, NDMO's own sort of planning figure for the waste fuel is on a million-year timescale. I mean, that's how long it requires isolation from the environment and human contact. There are significant upstream impacts as well. Uranium mine mill operations, particularly the tailings impoundment, and people may recognize one of these from Elliott Lake. Essentially, the figure there that's usually talked about is in the 250,000-year range, that these tailings impoundments will need to be effective on that kind of time scale. And uranium mine tailings are not only radioactive, they are chemically toxic, and they are acidic as well. So they do present a range of risks. Indeed, uranium mine tailings are the only mining waste which has been determined to be toxic by Health Canada and Environment Canada for the purposes of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So this is, in its own way, an exceptionally toxic waste stream. Functionally, there are a number of disadvantages as well. This is a very, very low flexibility energy option. Indeed, its defining feature is very high levels of lock-in and path dependency. If you make a decision to go down a nuclear path within your energy system, as we're learning in Ontario, you're basically likely to be stuck with that decision for a century or more. So even if technology changes over time, you're stuck with it. And this is becoming a more and more significant question in Ontario's context. So you're left with very low planning or operational resiliency or flexibility. Construction times are on the scale of, in Ontario, our most recent experience with Darlington was two decades. So you effectively end up with a very, very large power plant 20 years or more after you first conceived it, and as happened with Darlington, you may find the world has changed completely from the time at which you made this decision to build this plant and make this massive capital investment. And certainly the CANDUs and most nuclear reactors for power applications tend to have very low operational flexibility. They only have one setting, which is on. And so you can't turn them up or down to follow load. In Ontario, that has translated into a problem called surplus baseload generation, which basically means that the output from the nuclear power plants is more than the minimum grid demand, especially overnight about this time of year. And in fact, we've actually been having to pay other jurisdictions. It's called a negative price, but actually means we're paying them to take electricity off our hands because we can't turn the plants down. Serious economic problems. The technology, I don't think it's going too far to say, is simply uneconomic. And I mean, the industry is a creation of government and cannot survive without the support of governments, both in terms of liability absorption, but also in terms of financing as well. It's extremely difficult to attract private capital into the nuclear industry, even when governments are assuming the legacy, waste management, and other economic risks. We saw this, for example, in the United States during the Obama economic recovery legislation after 2008. They poured billions at the nuclear industry, and they got precisely one plant actually built, which only actually came into service last summer. We've seen the same thing with the supposedly renaissance projects in Finland, France, the UK, the US, massive cost overruns, massive delays. Indeed, at one point, Siemens sold off the project in Finland, which was supposed to be the flagship for their nuclear renaissance, for €1 to get it off their books. Hinkley Point, they still haven't finished. And indeed, we were having this kind of strange experience in Ontario because we sort of dodged this bullet on the last round, because we did actually ask for bids on new build nuclear in 2009. But the answer that came back, and indeed it was George Smither, who was the minister at the time, who was very smart and sort of asked, we're not subsidizing it. We need to know what the real cost is going to be. And the real cost that came back in that case was $23 to $26 billion for two 1,200 megawatt reactors, which was seen to be completely uneconomic. The delivered electricity cost was going to be over 20 cents a kilowatt hour on a full cost basis. And keeping in mind, even at that stage, we were only paying 14 cents for wind under the feed-in tariff program under the Green Energy Act. The Darlington refurbishment, which is proceeding, OPG asked for nearly 17 cents a kilowatt hour in front of the OEB to pay for that. So there's a fundamental problem in terms of the economics, even if governments are absorbing a lot of the implicit risk around waste management and decommissioning, and effectively nuclear plants are relieved of the full scale of potential liability of catastrophic accidents as well. They're basically capped out at $1 billion. To put that into context, the estimates on a major nuclear accident in Pickering or Darlington, east of Toronto, something like what happened here in Fukushima, are in the $1 trillion range. The sort of cutoff line is Yonge Street, everything east of Yonge Street. There is, of course, implicit in that, this extreme event risk, catastrophic accident risks, which simply don't exist in relation to other technologies. I caught a clip of Chernobyl on YouTube yesterday. Actually, it was the scene where Professor Legasov was saying in relation to the Chernobyl accident that nothing on Earth has ever, like this, has ever happened before. And we know at Fukushima we had a triple meltdown. These are risks that simply don't exist in relation to other energy technologies. And then there are these questions around weapons proliferation. What we have learned is that it is basically impossible to keep a determined state which has access to nuclear materials and nuclear capabilities from making nuclear weapons if it is determined to do so. This is the lesson from North Korea, the lesson from Iran, India, Pakistan, Israel, South Africa, and of course the power plants themselves and the waste fuel storage facilities are very significant security risks in and of themselves. We've been seeing an extreme version of that, of course, from the Zaporizhzhia facility in Ukraine right now. They've been having firefights and artillery duels over the plant. And one of the things that's been of particular concern is the waste fuel storage facilities there for a number of reasons. At least until relatively recently, nuclear effectively has been in decline. This kind of shows you had the big sort of build out in the 70s and 80s, which is the blue line sort of above the curve, and the brown below the x-axis is sort of the closure. And basically the trend has been downwards, that as the plants that were built in the 70s and 80s have reached end of life, they've been being retired. China is something of an exception to this, but certainly in Europe and North America, the trend has been downwards. There has been a great deal of attention recently to the notion of small modular reactors. The government of Canada and Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario are very, very keen on this idea that we would build small reactors on a kind of production line basis, and these supposedly would be more flexible, cheaper, and more reliable than the large power reactors that we've traditionally built. This would be more scalable. Lots of questions about this. Indeed, there is very active federal support. The one investor in one of the projects in Ontario, probably the one that's the most active, which is to build small modular reactors at the Darlington site, to build 4 300 megawatt reactors. The only investor so far is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is the government of Canada. Private capital, as usual, is not interested for a variety of reasons. SMRs face all kinds of problems. There is a fundamental existential one, that they simply do not exist, even as prototypes, in the kinds of roles that are being discussed as power, civilian power supply. The only significant application of the technology is a nuclear-powered submarine, which is, to put it mildly, an extreme application in terms of the requirements. We've seen very serious questions about whether the technology will work, whether it's remotely economic, and indeed we saw the sort of collapse of the NuScale initiative, which was sort of the flagship initiative in the United States at the end of last year. It suggested neither the economics nor the technology were going to work. These are technologies that the Canadian regulators have not ever seen before. What the CNSC is used to seeing is CANDUs. And what it understands is how CANDUs work, not other reactor designs. Very serious questions about cost and economic viability. This is from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. This is something they just released last week, looking at options for Ontario. They're putting new reactors in the 24.4 cent range, and that, I think, is a pretty credible figure. It seems to be where things are landing in terms of actual costs for new build power reactors. Almost done. Thank you. Based on the experience we're seeing in Europe and North America. So to put some context around that, new onshore wind that's going to be high with storage is less than half that in an Ontario context. And of course, energy efficiency is our best option at more than an order of magnitude less. In terms of the small modular reactors, and this becomes relevant in the NWMO conversation, it's not clear what the nature of the waste streams from these reactors actually will be. There have been questions about weapons proliferation risks, particularly in relation to one of the projects that's being floated in New Brunswick, the Voltex project, which is basically a breeder reactor, which basically produces more new isotopes from the waste. And this is relevant, I think, in the conversation we're having here, because NWMO is out there basically saying, we'll take anything. The original NWMO mandate was very focused on the waste from the existing CANDU fleet, which are relatively well characterized. We've been trying to think about this for 50 years. I think listening carefully now, they're out there very explicitly saying, well, we are the enabler of nuclear expansion. And part of the way we will do that is we will promise a solution to waste management from any type of reactor that gets built in Canada. The implication there is that any community that's agreeing to host the waste facility is effectively signing a blank check in terms of what the nature of the materials that might arrive at that facility and expect to be managed at it might actually be. I think that's an important caution around it. So to sort of wrap up very, very briefly in terms of the trade-offs, the answer to our question is nuclear sustainable energy option. Well, at best, it offers us some very, very ugly trade-offs. Yes, potentially low carbon, high volume energy source. On the other hand, a whole range of virtually every other dimension of sustainability you might think about: cost, non-carbon environmental and health impacts, inflexibility, technological lock-in, high path dependency, unique and uniquely severe catastrophic accident risks, unique security and weapons proliferation risks. In some ways, this is the ultimate dual-use technology. Its origins are tied up with the nuclear weapons program. And it is, as we've seen, very, very difficult to control that crossover if you're dealing with a determined state. So, and there is the waste management and legacy questions as well. So I think the answer is that this should only be considered as a decarbonization option of last resort when all other alternatives have been exhausted. And in the talk I gave yesterday for the university, I made the case, well, we're not there yet, to put it mildly. That we have a lot of options available to us. The problem has been an unwillingness on the part of the provincial government to consider them seriously. And indeed, it seems very much, as pointed yesterday, but at the moment, the government of Ontario has committed to, by my rough estimate, $100 billion nuclear construction and expansion program in Ontario. Which probably makes it the biggest nuclear construction program in North America or Europe at the moment. Proceeds. We were talking to a colleague from Finland about this, and we were saying, Canada now the center of the nuclear renaissance, and indeed Ontario the center of the nuclear renaissance. To which it would seem to be the answer is yes. That is the pathway that we seem to be on. And that then has obvious implications in terms of the volumes of waste and the nature of the waste that a community that's asked to receive it is going to be taking on. That's probably a good place to end, because I'm over time, and I need to, and Laura, I think, has some very important things to say as well around this question. I assume we should, if you want to, I think we should probably both speak first, and then have the questions after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call up Dodi Legasik to introduce our next speaker.
We are very pleased tonight to have Laura Tanguay come to speak with us this evening. Laura Tanguay has a master's degree in environmental policy and is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. Her research deals with environmental and climate justice. Of particular interest to us is that she has been researching consent mechanisms in the nuclear siting process. In fact, her doctoral project considers whether consent mechanisms embedded in impact assessments can result in more just processes. Laura also works to support Indigenous communities who are confronted with settler land use and water use propositions. Would you please welcome tonight Laura Tanguay.
Well, first I'll just start by saying thanks so much for the invitation. I wouldn't be here or doing the research that I do without many of the people who are in this audience. I strive to do community-based research, so it's with many thanks for many of the work that everybody in this room has done. I want to thank Dodie, Brittany, who's not here, Wendy, who I've learned so much from over the last couple of years, and of course my colleague Mark. So I do wear several hats. I've been involved in the technical aspect of some extractive contexts within impact assessments, which is actually where the interest for consent-based mechanisms was formed. I'll speak to that in a moment. And I should note, and you might have seen perhaps in earlier iterations of the posters, or perhaps if you've Googled me ahead of time, but I also am the water policy coordinator with the Canadian Environmental Law Association. And I will just offer a disclaimer that the analyses I offer in my research is not necessarily on behalf of, does not necessarily share the views of the Canadian Environmental Law Association, as these are divergent hats that I'm wearing. So my presentation today will be on behalf of my research that I do as part of my doctoral dissertation. So I'll give a little bit of my own positionality here as well. I'm actually from just downstream of Chalk River, where Canadian Nuclear Laboratories is. You might have heard of the near-surface disposal facility siting at Chalk River that was just approved in January. So I worked with some community organizations opposing the siting of that infrastructure for a number of reasons, which I'll sort of speckle throughout this presentation today. I think I'll leave it there for my positionality. And throughout my dissertation research, I engage primarily with concepts of environmental justice, and sustainable development becomes a big part of that conversation. And I'm gonna hopefully get to a little bit of a digression at the end if I have the time. Oh, I don't need to look, it's right here. You live and you learn. So a big part of my research topic, as I mentioned, I came to it from an extractive context. So I worked with a research group that looked at Indigenous-led impact assessments in Canada in various different jurisdictions, in different provinces and territories and treaty contexts. And we inquired of what makes an Indigenous-led impact assessment really truly Indigenous-led. And one of the main criteria that we landed on was that the community is able to apply or withhold consent. So if an Indigenous community goes through the entire process and provides resources and expertise into an impact assessment, but ultimately at the end of the day, throughout the consultation process, the government still has unilateral decision-making authority, what we're really looking for is for consent. And so the willing host model became a part of this conversation. We thought, wow, that sounds really great. On paper, it certainly does. And throughout the research that I've done for my dissertation, I've learned about the lack of linearity of the willing host model, and thanks to a lot of people in community who've been willing to speak up, and some historical observations as well. But that's really poised as sort of this really excellent model wherein the duty to consult is something that you might be familiar with in both extractive contexts, and again, with the near-surface disposal facility for radioactive waste, the duty to consult was the mechanism used. And if you're familiar with that assessment, the Algonquin communities who participated effectively showed that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission breached their duty to consult, and there was actually an extension given because of that, because of the inadequacy of the way that the duty to consult was discharged. And after the site was approved in January of this year, in February, Keweenaw First Nation filed a federal judicial review of the decision based on the lack of the duty to consult. Okay, so this is very small, but mostly it's just up there so you have something to look at while I talk a little bit. I did want to say a few more things about the duty to consult, but The, let's just see where I'm going here. Okay, so the NWMO, which at this point I think we're all pretty familiar with, but so the mandate is listed here. So the NWMO came about following the Seaborn Panel, which was a federal environmental assessment review panel that was established in 1989 to independently review AECL's DGR. The Government of Canada brought into force the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, and waste producers established the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in 2002. So also in 2002, AECB, Atomic Energy Control Board, became the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and it is responsible for issuing the necessary licenses for the potential deep geological repository, and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada is responsible for conducting the environmental impact assessment of the designated nuclear projects and activities, including the DGR. So here is the NWMO's guiding principles for what the willing host model looks like. I don't know if you can see that, the text is pretty small, but I'll highlight a few things. One is that it says the host community must be informed and willing to accept the project. Later, I will talk a little bit about some of the concerns or criticisms there are around what constitutes the host community, what constitutes willingness, and what constitutes being informed. There's also a bullet point here that says focus on nuclear provinces and provinces directly involved in the nuclear fuel cycle. And when we come to talk about this question of consent, and we're talking about the nuclear fuel cycle that Mark spoke about as well, when we're talking about uranium mining, we're talking about fuel, energy production, and ultimately waste, there wasn't a lot of decision-making and consent that was enabled through choosing to become a nuclear province. And there's also the right to withdraw, and at any point until the final agreement is signed, and that the community will be willing to proceed to the next step only if they choose to do so, and that the siting process will respect Aboriginal rights and treaties, and the duty to consult and accommodate, which again poses some other issues about how that will be charged and how that will go through. So some other concerns about the willing host model or the willing host concept is what maybe influences willingness. And so some of these things to be considered are the stigma of a nuclear community. So some of the influences include the effects on reputation, like tourism and agricultural sectors, culture, so the power dynamics and the relationships between location, industry, and society, and how geographical remoteness, economic marginality, and political powerlessness can lead to a culture of acceptance. There's environmental justice concerns, so disproportionate impacts on marginalized communities. Here comes the question of who faces the burden and who gains the greatest benefit. We just saw how much of Ontario has the benefit of this low GHG energy production, but there will be a much smaller percentage of the population of Ontario who will be burdened with hosting the waste. There's also a question of coercion and consent, so the perception of what the benefit might be, of compensation for living next to a radioactive waste site, and of community perceptions of justice and social acceptance. And this includes the procedural and distributive dimensions of trust. And so this is what I have most experience with the near-surface disposal facility siting, which I think I will talk a little bit more about, but I'm happy to also talk about after. I wanted to raise one comment from Dr. Gordon Edwards, who I understand spoke here, I think last year, but in the 2002 ENVI committee, the Environmental Committee in the House of Commons, Dr. Edwards says, what is a willing host community? If you talk about the Ignace situation, the actual disposal site that they're looking at is Revel Lake, which is not in Ignace, but is halfway between Ignace and another major city on the Trans-Canada Highway. So this should be a regional matter. There's also going to be transportation of this waste on highways leading up to that region. These transportations are going to be going on for many decades, and moreover, when they get to these regions, they're going to have to unpackage the radioactive waste bundle by bundle and repackage it into smaller containers. And this has to be done with robotic equipment behind the 6 6-foot thick leaded glass windows. People were not told about this until just last year when I brought it up during one of my presentations. People are being given incentives, they're being given money, but they're not being given information about what kinds of downsides they might have to deal with. I think that it's only fair that full and informed consent be that, in fact, fully informed. So this is again just the NWMO stages for site selection of a nuclear waste repository. I just highlighted step 5 and 7. So step 5 is where the NWMO is really hoping to get to very soon, the acceptance of the host repository to be confirmed. And step 7, the independent, formal, and public process conducted by the regulatory authority, which will be the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, to ensure all requirements are satisfied. And so in this step 7 is where sort of some of the aspects of procedural justice come into question. And I'm going to raise the questions surrounding this in my last few slides. Some of the concerns that I have both observed and heard about and read about with the regulators in the Canadian context are here. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's framework allows for a significant amount of negotiation between the regulator and the nuclear industry, which might compromise transparency and hinder public engagement. The negotiated approach can also lead to concerns about regulatory capture, where the regulator becomes unduly influenced by the industry it was meant to oversee. There are concerns about sufficient independence from industry and continued reporting to the same federal minister responsible for promoting nuclear power, despite long-standing calls from civil society for this to be remedied. The Auditor General of Canada found in its examination of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and its management of nuclear power plants in 2016 that the CNSC had insufficient or incomplete documentation to support or explain its planning decisions. It could not show how it had taken risks into account when making decisions about which inspections it would and would not carry out each year. The CNSC's planning process, yes, must be flexible enough to respond to unforeseen events or issues, but that doesn't preclude it from the systematic, well-documented process so that the CNSC can demonstrate that its planning considers the risks and that it allocates enough staff at the levels needed to commensurate with the risks. Oh, I haven't even gotten to the NWMO yet. So the NWMO is made up of industry, Ontario Power Generation, New Brunswick Power Corporation, and Hydro-Quebec. And adaptive phase management was suggested by the NWMO and accepted by the Canadian government. So the owners of the radioactive waste are responsible for funding, organizing, managing, and the operation of disposal of other facilities facilities required for their waste. So there are concerns that even though this process seems transparent, in reality, it might not be fully open to public scrutiny. This means that people might not have a full understanding of what's happening with the nuclear waste. The nuclear industry controls the NWMO and its advisory council, and this raises concerns about whether the industry's interests might outweigh public safety and environmental considerations, and the absence of a direct role for Canadian Parliament in this process has been raised by scholars, law reform advocates, and concerned citizens alike. It implies less governmental oversight and less opportunity for public or legislative input on decisions. I've also heard some analysis suggest that the NWMO's eagerness towards siting is to pass on their liability as nuclear waste owners to a DGR and no longer be responsible for the legacy and ultimately also now future wastes. In terms of social license, an aspect that has been considered by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada in a report, an expert panel report, Building Common Ground, a vision for new impact assessment in Canada, they have noted that public trust and confidence is crucial to all parties. Without it, an assessment approval will lack the social acceptance necessary to facilitate project development. While some would likely favor the Nuclear Energy Board and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for the assessment of projects in their particular industries, the erosion of public trust in the current process has created a belief among many that the outcomes are illegitimate. This in turn has led some to believe that the outcomes are preordained and that there is no use in participating in the review process because views will not be taken into account. The consequence of this is that there's a higher likelihood of protests and court challenges, longer timeframes to get to decisions, and less certainty that the decision will actually be realized, or in short, the absence of social license. And Mark did talk a little bit about perpetual stewardship, but I just wanted to give an example of the giant mine, which is something that I talk about in one of my classes, and I really do see a lot of sort of overlap with the siting of radioactive wastes and with the situation in the giant mine. So, which is in the Northwest Territories, and it's a gold mine. The Yellowknives Dene First Nation had lived on the surrounding land for centuries, and now they have to deal with the prospect of living with arsenic trioxide for eternity. The giant mine produced 7 million ounces of gold over a period of 55 years between 1948 and 1999, which, when we're considering the lifespan of a nuclear waste repository, that's a really short period of time. The companies that controlled the mine made $1.1 billion, it's pretty good, in 2002 dollars in profit, and the government collected $572 million, it's pretty good, in taxes and royalties, but they also provided $59 million in subsidies to the mine. 2023 data suggests that the cleanup is going to be $4.3 billion by the time it is complete in 2038, after which some aspects of the site, including 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide dust stored underground in frozen chambers, will require perpetual care and maintenance. The site spans 900 hectares, has 13.5 tons of contaminated soil, a landfill, 6 tailings ponds, and 100 buildings. The mine went bankrupt, and Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada, which at the time took responsibility for dealing with the cleanup of the site. Remediation of the mine focuses on isolating and containing the arsenic trioxide using a frozen block method. The arsenic trioxide will remain toxic forever. So I watched a video from the proponent at the time that the mine was active that discussed how all of the safety mechanisms and the prosperity to the community at the time, and it was convincing. This frozen block method is because at the time it was believed that the arsenic trioxide dust could be contained underground because it was frozen, it was covered in permafrost. But because of mining and other disruptions to the ecosystem and to the climate, that permafrost is no longer frozen. And so the frozen block method, not only this site will require perpetual, and I mean forever, care and maintenance, but it will also require perpetual, and I mean forever, investment to keep the ground frozen. So the frozen block method has been described as something as similar to the way that you would keep a hockey rink cold. And for all of these cases, for the near-surface disposal facility, for the deep geological repository, and for the giant mine, when we talk about eternity and we talk about forever, we don't only mean for the lives of the people in this room, our children, our grandchildren, but their children, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, for generations that we can't even really imagine. So this is a picture of the giant mine site that I intended to show. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes here if you'll indulge me. So in a class that I was leading a tutorial in at the University of Toronto, a lot of the conversation about why nuclear, and for a lot of the young, very bright students who are interested in nuclear as a solution to climate change, a big part of it has come from what Mark talked about of the pros of nuclear energy. There's an economist, environmental economist, John Broome, who wrote a book called Climate Matters, and he draws this idea of a sacrifice-free solution to climate change, and this involves an intergenerational transfer mechanism. So I've highlighted some of it here. So some of it is that you would compensate emitters for reducing emissions, and it leaves them no worse off, but it makes everybody else, like the receivers, better off. Where does the compensation come from? Current receivers shouldn't have to pay the cost, then they wouldn't be better off. Future generations can pay the cost and be compensated by the benefits of a better society overall. The problem is that this requires the worse off to pay the cost so that the better off don't have to make any sacrifices and they can maintain their current level of benefit or the status quo. So this is the sacrifice-free solution to climate change, and it's because of the consideration that the most urgent problem is slowing climate change, but that fairness and distribution of wealth and of equity is secondary. So if we can get emitters to stop imposing costs on everyone, this will be a victory. So this actually is, I see it as being quite similar to what we're looking to do here, is like continue with our status quo to produce nuclear energy, to, again, as Canada has done forever, divorce the concepts of waste and energy production, and the idea now is that we are not burdening future generations with this waste. We are going to find the solution of a deep geological repository, but the reality is that future generations are going to be considered and burdened with the maintenance and the monitoring of a deep geological repository, but also with the economic burden that we are putting on them by continuing to invest in nuclear waste. So the second framework here was relational intergenerational justice, which asks to instead look at trying to solve issues of equity within our current generation, to ask communities and all people, instead of relying on sort of a technocratic analysis of the best way to solve climate change, and worry about what communities would be sacrificed in the now, and carry on this sort of more wholesome agreement of equity into future generations. And so I asked the students which model will allow them to be better ancestors to future generations, and there was a mixed bag, but there was a highly saturated acceptance that the relational intergenerational justice model ultimately would allow us to be better ancestors if we worry about the equity disparities in our current generation. So I'm going to put these questions here. So these are some questions for everybody to consider, I think, when talking about nuclear waste, and I'm going to also just talk about some of them that I've heard from my research directly. One, that critical voices lack recognition, that there is a discrepancy of expert voices and the layperson's voice. There are concerns of safety, risks on the transportation route, to surface water, to groundwater in the event of an accident or over time. There are also unknown risks. And in the example of the giant mine, we don't know what the environment is going to be like in 100 years, or in 1,000 years, or in 2,000 years. So there are risks that we don't even know about yet. There's lack of trust in industry accountability and transparency. The creation of the NWMO is not arm's length or democratic. It is made up of waste producers who have a vested interest in getting waste sited quickly, as promises have been made to stakeholders nationally and internationally about how close we are to achieve this willingness from a host community. I've heard this from colleagues in Europe and the United States this week. There's a lack of fairness towards understanding of community and of willingness. Are the people being consulted the ones who would be impacted the most? Are Indigenous and treaty rights being respected? Are all of the affected communities being consulted, for example, including those on the transportation routes? What is the geographic definition of impacted community and of the environment? When projects are approved, the proponent has leverage to make changes or amendments, particularly in an adaptive management approach, and the host loses all leverage after signing the contract. So I've seen this in extractive contexts in IAs, and when Mark talked about the blank check, this is also what he's referring to. Once the agreement is signed, the leverage is gone from the community. High projected costs now and into the future. Most, if not all, nuclear projects are underestimated, at least at first, so actual costs will likely be much higher. The question of intergenerational justice, who are we protecting and how, and of perpetual stewardship into the future. So, 3 perspectives while we look ahead. 1 from willingness determinations, again, who is included, who is left out. How does this play into future steps into the process? Our environmental rights, protected? The right to participate, the right to know, the right to information, are they protected? From an environmental assessment standpoint, are there information gaps? What remains unknown? For example, sources of waste, types of fuel, and as Mark mentioned, the NWMO is now allowing additional wastes, not just can-do wastes into the DGR, so these are things that we still don't know. We don't even know what types of waste SMRs will produce. What happens in the event of an accident or a malfunction? And for nuclear licensing, this is an operational regulatory decision, and so larger decisions about the site and the host have already been made. The CNSC itself says it doesn't have a strong role in site selection or nuclear policy, so this stage might occur many years into the future. So looking forward to any questions that you might have, and yeah, thank you so much for having us today, and we've already got a few questions, so I don't know if we want to turn to everyone. Unless you want to, I think she'll be good. Okay. Oh, yeah.
If you point, I'll walk
To the next person. We'll start in the back here.
Both of our speakers have painted a pretty scary picture of what may happen here. As worried as I am about the DGR storing materials that have a half-life of tens of thousands of years, the longest lasting government in the world south of the border is only 250 years. Our ability to manage ourselves in this material for tens of thousands of years, I'm a little skeptical. But what worries me even more is the transportation between southern Ontario and thus through Tanguay to the Lake Superior watershed. So I've heard a statistic, and I wonder if either of our speakers or anyone can confirm what I've heard, and that is that we're talking about, on average, 3 trucks a day for 50 years. Is that close to being accurate? And if not, what is the number? That's even more worrisome.
It depends on how many trucks a day, but yeah, that's the basic figure. So I've seen up to 175 years of traffic, depending on what assumptions you're making. And that's basically because you got to recognize, I'd have to look at the exact figure, but there's 3 million plus fuel bundles in storage at the 5 reactor sites. So yeah, you're talking a process over decades, if not centuries. Just the transportation phase.
Bonjour, Gima, Nishnakaz, Kiafza, Ding Donji, Ogishkamin Steve Zayde Dolem, Chimiquich, Kenawaya, Chimiquich. Name is Chief Wilfred King from the Gull Bay First Nation, about 2 hours north of Thunder Bay. I'm glad that you organized this meeting today because our First Nation has serious concerns about nuclear waste. We do not support it in any way or any form. But I'm here also to talk about other matters. Our community, and again, it's related to the subject that we're talking about, because this nuclear facility is to power up industry. It's here to power up homes. We all like to turn on the air conditioner at night when it's 90 degrees in our homes. But for Gull Bay First Nation, our ancestral lands were flooded by 3 hydroelectric facilities on the Nipigon River. Again, we were also flooded in the 1940s by the Ogoki diversion. Our community is one of 4 communities in Ontario that will be never hooked up to the grid, according to the plan for electrification in Ontario. Gull Bay, White Sand First Nation, Fort Severn, and I believe it's Winnisk. the two communities on the Hudson Bay coast. Now, it's a real shame that our community is not going to be hooked up to the provincial grid, but yet we've been producing 300 megawatts of power annually. Billions of dollars has been made on the electrification of Ontario through homes and through the ratepayers, through the industry that's benefiting. But yet our community is not benefiting from electricity. We're still burning dirty diesel in our community. And it's a shame that our community has suffered immensely. You know, graves were desecrated. Our lands were flooded. We're dealing with mercury contamination in our food source now. So I'm really disappointed, but I want to talk about another matter of recent vintage. There is a mine site north of here about an hour. It's called the Lac des Îles mine. They mine platinum, palladium, and a few other minerals. On early January, there was a spill on one of the rivers. And I'm not sure anybody knows about it because it didn't hit the news locally. Didn't even, people, yet there's all kinds of vehicles driving up and down there. We were on site for 37 days monitoring that spill. And as far as I can see is that MOECP is in bed with the government. They're in bed with industry. You know, we raised concerns at these meetings, and yet we didn't get nowhere with them. You know, they said, well, you don't have a right to be consulted on these matters because we're the government and we're looking after this. The solution was that they couldn't remediate the spill. There was just no way they could do it because it was water, it was the weather, it was winter, and so forth. And their plan was, we're just going to bury it and we'll come and visit it later. So if they can't remediate a spill dealing with platinum and palladium, how the hell are they going to remediate a nuclear spill? So I'm really concerned about that. You know, and there's been no concerns raised, none whatsoever. I never got a call from anybody and said, hey chief, what the hell's going on at the Lac des Îles mine? You know, I understand that there was a spill there. You know, and those, the concentrate is carcinogenic, it's very clear. And I think the real answer here, folks, is that, you know, we're looking at Lake Nipigon, for example. You know, that lake has sustained its time immemorial, and it always will do that. And we have to take a stronger look in terms of Aboriginal consultation. You know, First Nations have to be consulted. And you're right when you say First Nations, you need their consent because it is our territory, it is our land. And I don't care what anybody says here right now. I have a law degree. I understand what the doctrine of discovery means. I understand what the notion of terra nullius, what that means. I understand what the assertion of crown sovereignty. I understand. You know what that is? That's all a bunch of baloney. It's a legal fiction. Because the right people, and you look what happened in just recently in British Columbia where they recognized Aboriginal title to the Haida Nation. And that's what's going to protect the environment is Aboriginal and treaty rights. Miigwech.
Scott has a quick follow-up, is that okay?
Sure.
Well, thank you, Wilfred King. Wilfred King has employed me numerous times throughout the decades since we've known each other back in school days and so on, educational contexts. And I stand with him fully on his words just now. It's all very emotional stuff when you grow up in northwestern Ontario and you went fishing and hunting with your dad. By the way, my name is Scott Kyle. I've been broadcasting on Lakehead University campus on behalf of Dodie Legassic and Graham Saunders and Wendy O'Connor and Charles Faust, and they've been educating me as a part-time volunteer journalist with my broadcasting show about all these matters. And I just wanted to make a few anecdotal comments. I mean, if you buy in, it's increasingly disturbing to me that in so-called environmentalists, and I would certainly toss myself in that category because of what is the alternative? So you're an environmentalist, and what are you? You know, what is the alternative to caring about the earth at this critical juncture for humanity? So yes, we have to stand with Aboriginal folks and Indigenous concerns and so on. They are the foundation from which we need to learn and project ourselves forward. Now, forgive me in advance for forgetting the term that Dodi Legasik over here, one-woman warrior against this horrendous project that's proposed me up to Ignis, for not remembering the name, the Ojibwe word. But I've got it in my heart anyway, for a person who's able to think into future generations. And the very fact that they have a word for that.
The word is Tataganogan.
Tataganogan. Thank you. So, the very fact, my point is this, the very fact that they have a word for that should be enlightening in and of itself for our culture. Okay, because it is unto the 7th generation of yet unborn great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren that look up to us from, the faces look up from the earth. This is a teaching. What are we going to do when we decide upon whether something is right or wrong today, here and now? Those faces are looking up at us, and those child's faces are looking up at us and saying, do you know right from wrong? Do you still know right from wrong? Because I'll tell you one thing right now. Where all these fuel bundles are sitting right now, great big swimming pools or however they are on the surface of the planet, ask yourself this. Is there a great big giant black hole or a zombie apocalypse in that area? Presently? No, there isn't. So what's the hurry? What's the hurry in the transport? This is absolute insanity that the fox is looking after the hen house. NWMO, an independent sort of godlike scientific entity or business entity, we have to stop driving the economy. This is all about corporate concerns and driving the economy. David Suzuki from 30 or 40 years ago saying the same thing. We must stop driving the economy and start spending time sitting down on the floor playing with our kids and knowing where this is going. What could go wrong transporting nuclear waste on rails that regularly derail? And on the highway, what could possibly go wrong? So, and I've told Wilfred this too, I'm a little disappointed in the Aboriginal community for not having, I mean, he looked around and he said, where are they here today? We had a little chuckle. So he's here, he's made his voice clear. And, you know, I get a little disappointed in that front, but having said that, it's not a racially charged moment. It's an accurate moment. We want to see more engagement there as well. There's 4 colors on that medicine wheel. This is a problem for all of us. And I was the environmental consultant between Gull Bay and the Lac des Îles mine. Didn't take long for them, both the camps, they couldn't agree on anything, and they shunted this position out. That's fine. That's fine. But, you know, and I'll leave off with this. The environmentalists. You know, there are some environmentalists, and I know them. I know a lot of people in this room. And I honor them for the way they fought for various things, artistic and environmental and otherwise over the years. And increasingly I'm having people say, well, you know, Scott, you know, I'm changing my view on this, the whole climate change narrative and this and that. And, you know, I think it is clean. I think it's going to be safe. And my first retort to it is, you like your nuclear energy now that it's arrived on your doorstep up here in God's country? How are you enjoying your $15 piece of toast in the morning? Because that's what it took to cook that piece of toast. I mean, and 6-foot lead glass containment, it's utter insanity.
Just to give the speakers a chance to respond.
I would want to acknowledge the chief and thank him for his remarks. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think the question of the relationship with Indigenous peoples is one that scares NWO. Because it is where there is structural legal power. And I think we've seen that reflected in some of the AFN resolutions as well. So I can't say more than that, other than absolutely I agree with you on what you said there. And I think it's going to be it's an interesting dynamic to play out here, but it is the one probably that makes NWO nervous more than anything else, I suspect.
Just also want to agree with that. Thank you so much, Chief, for your comments. I very much agree with you, and to your point of if they can't manage the effluent from a mine? How can they manage endless, forever radioactive waste? On the way here, I got an email from Kibawek First Nation who noted that Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, the Chalk River site that I was mentioning, has now been charged with 2 months of leaking effluent from a hazardous sewage into the Ottawa River, and he made the same point of how can we trust them with not leaching radioactive waste into the river, but instead, if they can't even manage hazardous waste effluent from a sewage treatment plant.
I just have a supplementary, again, I won't take too long of your time, but at the 70 First Nations, resolutions have been passed. At the Chiefs of Ontario, resolutions have been passed. I spoke on those resolutions to oppose nuclear waste. I know that they're trying to woo, the First Nation community, Wabigoon Lake First Nation. I know the chief there. I know his father quite well. I think at the end of the day, regardless if Wabigoon supports it or not, the position of the chiefs would be no to this. I could pretty much say that in unequivocal terms. One of the key things is that even if Wabigoon wanted to accept this, I think they're going to have a fight on their hands against other First Nations because we're a signatory to the Robinson-Severe Treaty, and we're not going to allow that waste to transect our communities. We have a lot of rivers that we're concerned about, and you will see unanimous support, and there will be taken not only legal action, but direct action to stop the transportation of this nuclear waste to our territories. Miigwech.
Work your way along.
Yeah, my name is Paul Filthorne, volunteer with We the Nuclear Free North. I especially appreciate the comments of the chief on the impacts of the mining industry right across Canada. It's a huge problem, an internal problem. My question is, you cited the low carbon energy footprint of the nuclear industry. It seems to be there's low carbon is their chief selling point. Have you ever seen an independent audit of this figure?
Yeah, I mean, the part of it is sitting on the chair there. There has been quite a lot of analysis on this. It depends a bit on assumptions that you make in supply chains about how carbon intensive they are and how certain fuel production processes work, although the CANDU process, because it's not enriched, is relatively low carbon, and there does seem to be a pretty good consensus in the literature on that. The problem is that with nuclear, it fails every other test of sustainability you can imagine, which as I laid out. And so it puts you into this at best, very, very ugly trade-off type of situation. And the question then becomes, well, is there a pathway out of the trade-off? To which I've argued, others have argued, yes, there are ways you can decarbonize without relying on nuclear. And that's the pathway that we should be taking for both economic and environmental reasons. But on the low carbon question per se, that's not an easy argument to win. We did drag them in front of the Competition Bureau over claiming they were zero carbon. But all of the analyses I've seen, they're relatively low carbon relative to fossil fuels. As I say, the problem is the non-carbon environmental impacts, which are huge. The legacy questions, because you're basically exchanging one problem into the future of climate change for another, which is a waste fuel stream, which represents weapons proliferation, safety, security risks, on evolutionary timescales. The answer there is well, you have to find another path that doesn't force you into that kind of a trade-off between different aspects of sustainability. It's the best answer I can give. There's quite a literature on this, and it does seem to be pretty clear that, yeah, they're relatively low carbon. The problem is everything else you can imagine in terms of impacts and risks: cost, weapons proliferations, accidents, legacy, non-carbon environmental and health impacts. All are best described as unique and extreme. Would be my portrayal of the nuclear industry in most times.
Hi, Lise Bourgeois, here, MPP, Thunder Bay Superior North. I want to connect a few more dots and then maybe comment on it. So we have a government that's a born-again EV proponent. They also see electrical vehicles as the absolute economic cure to everything, which means that we need much more power than we have. So for example, in the north, we don't have power to have heat pumps widely up here. We don't have the power to, if everybody had an EV, we wouldn't have the power. And that's not even talking about the infrastructure that's missing. So what we have right now is massive investment in Southern Ontario in EV manufacturing. Right, so we just announced, Honda just announced it's going to open 4 plants, Toyota's coming, Stellantis is here. It's massive. And then you have this big demand for more electricity. There's a lot of ideological push behind it, but I think, you know, for many of us, like, we have been told and learned that EVs are the solution. It's time for this electrical revolution. Everything's going to be electrified. We're going to give up on fossil fuels. So I just want to put the nuclear thing in the middle of this. If you have the misfortune ever of listening to Question Period at Queen's Park, you can hear Minister Todd Smith, who used to be a radio jockey, expound on clean, green, and beautiful nuclear energy, small nuclear reactors. We're bringing them to the north. This is going to be the solution to everything. And, you know, the NDP are idiots and you're against everything. That's the way the conversations go. And that is, they're extremely effective at disseminating this narrative. So I'm hoping you can comment on that.
Well, the long answer is the webinar I did yesterday for the university, which will be posted and we'll make available. It's less the EVs in terms of demand, it's space heating, which is the real challenge. And the problem we're also having, on the part that Mr. Smith doesn't talk about, of course, is that at the moment, the growth curve in greenhouse gas emissions from electricity in Ontario is essentially vertical. Because of the ramp up of the role of gas plants, in part because of the over-dependence on nuclear, because now we have the whole nuclear fleet basically going on the blink simultaneously, which is essentially how we ended up with the problem with coal plants. Was the same thing, is that we had, because we relied on the single technology, which all had end of life at the same time, and we had to go to even an equally bad, although in different ways, source of energy. In terms of the answer, there has been probably more work done in Ontario than any other jurisdiction in Canada in terms of pathways to decarbonization that don't rely on a large expansion of gas and don't rely on certainly an expansion of nuclear and certainly not even the refurbishment of Pickering B. We're probably stuck with Bruce because they've got that contract so locked in, there's no way out. I point in particular to the work done by the Atmospheric Fund, modeling out pathways to the mid-2030s. I looked at the work the David Suzuki Foundation did on this, using models which in some ways I think are more sophisticated than the ones the IESO itself uses. And I would also look at some of the work that's come out of the IESO itself, looking at the potential around distributed energy resources and around energy efficiency, because the work that was done by Dunsky and Power Advisory on DERs, that's really a groundbreaking study. And when I say DERs, this is basically rooftop solar, other distributed sources wired together with storage into microgrids at the distribution levels at the level of the community. Their conclusion was there was both technically feasible and economic potential to obviate the need for any new gas, and indeed for the expansion of the role of the existing gas plants. Task work suggested, well, we certainly don't need additional nuclear, and we don't need to do Pickering B. So we just had a new efficiency potential study, because again, the Ford government, of course, tore up a perfectly good energy efficiency strategy 5 years ago. So that there is a large potential there that is unrealized. And then, of course, Monsieur Legault repeatedly made offers of exports from Quebec to Ontario, which Mr. Ford ignored. Now to the point, unfortunately, where Quebec is somewhat on a different path, though that door is not closed completely. So there are different pathways for Ontario. The problem has been we're dealing with a provincial government that refuses to consider it. It's on this crazy nuclear, $100 billion commitment on nuclear. And it's this nuclear and gas pathway, which is the epitome of unsustainability. There are pathways to decarbonize that don't compel us to go down that road, and those are the ones we need to be taking. It's particularly ironic, of course, because Mr. Smith is out there saying, well, this is all about decarbonization. At the same time, the province has no strategy about electrification of transportation, no strategy on electrification of space heating, and indeed is in the process of trying to expand access to the gas grid for space heating purposes. So it's in my view a mess, to put it politely, and quite disingenuous. Those ads, I'm trying to drag them in front of the Competition Bureau again over that one, but they have been very effective, and I think partially because those of us who were in my previous life in the environmental community and others, we kind of thought we'd won this battle on the nuclear thing when we fought off the new builds now 15 years ago, and then we thought Pickering was end of life. It was going to close. We were on a downward trajectory. I think we've been taken a little off guard by this complete 180. And suddenly, as I said, we had a colleague actually from Spain, but he's Finnish, yesterday sort of commenting to us, well, how did this happen? That Ontario and Canada have become the center of the global nuclear renaissance? And the answer is a good question. Part of it being, though, a combination of a complete lack of any meaningful planning process, where there is no external review or assessment process. There is nowhere where we ask the question in front of an objective regulator, does the pathway we're choosing here make sense? The system is being run on the basis of political directives, and that's explicit. And then also, bluntly, a provincial government for which asking hard questions is not a noted area of strength. And so you've got OPG and Bruce Power in there telling them, the lights are going out tomorrow if you don't do exactly what we tell you. And not necessarily feeling they have the expertise or inclination to ask hard questions about that. That's a longer answer than I was planning.
I'll add just a little bit of a different context, but just in terms of how we're talking a little bit about life cycle I just want to note that a large part of the push towards EVs requires mining in the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario. And I've done a lot of work with Nishigantaga First Nation and the chief and leadership there. And there's a group of communities who would like a moratorium on mining in the region, and particularly who have faced many of the very adverse impacts to mining in the region. And I stand with those communities who oppose mining in the Ring of Fire for the reasons of their own territorial jurisdiction, but also because the peatlands hold more carbon than would be saved by the use of electric vehicles in all of Canada. So it kind of just seems a bit of a lose-lose situation there. But I do feel as though nuclear and EVs have one thing in common, where the government can use it as a big push towards, again, maintaining the status quo with the use of a technological promise and nothing else having to change. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add more to that, because I was co-investigator on an ecological services valuation on the Boreal. And of course, one of the key findings was just how much carbon was in the peat. I mean, this is a global scale carbon sink and storage site. And you will not be able to put that back if you destroy it. The other dimension of this, just because another research line, I didn't bring that with me, but on the critical minerals and EVs, the other question, of course, is the potential for circularity in terms of the supply chains. That can you close the supply chains? And what we discovered there is that the policy framework around that in North America is simply non-existent. There is nothing in terms of any kind of policy framework around recovery of end-of-life EV batteries, nothing to facilitate reuse, disassembly. The Europeans just adopted a whole new directive on this last June, which introduces requirements for battery passports, which are essential for reuse, recycling, requirements for recycled content, reporting around what is even happening. Because we could not find most basic answers about what happens to end-of-life EV batteries. And of course, there's an obvious link, because if you can close the loop, that reduces the demand for primary extraction, for the mining, which is a really high impact activity. So though we are just a blank, like we didn't do the human participants right, so we couldn't actually record the sound of the crickets on the other end of the phone when we started asking federal agencies, provinces, U.S. states, U.S. EPA, what are the rules here? And what are you doing around EV battery recycling, material recovery? And the answer in North America is a complete, total, absolute blank.
I just have one comment. The James Bay lowland is very important, like the Amazon, to this place. They're talking about mining there. You know what? There are too many ironies in the Ring of Fire.
The gentleman here has had his hand for a while, and we'll move back.
Thank you. This is inspiring, a little depressing, but inspiring. My name is Charles Post. I'm with Wheaton Nuclear Free North, Environment North, and Nuclear Free Thunder Bay. I'd like to point to a seeming paradox and get your comment on it if you so choose. The time required to save the planet using new nuclear production will come too late to save the planet.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. There's no way. Given the timeframes IPCC is giving us, nuclear simply cannot be deployed on the scale that's required and the speed that's required. This will come through technologies that can be deployed much more quickly, and that tends to point in the direction of renewables, demand-side measures, distributed resources, those kinds of measures, as opposed to, I mean, nuclear's, things go well. It's decade-long time frames, and things with nuclear construction projects never go well. So, questions. And that's, that's just the record, and the folks, the World Nuclear Energy Status Report that comes out every year is a very good documentation of all of that in terms of timelines and problems. Further questions? There's a couple, one over here, there's one down here, and a lady over there.
I'll try to make this briefly here. My name is David Monroe. I started studying this a number of years ago when I was in Horn Pain fishing, and I saw all the flyers that are trying to entice the community to become part of this process. My question then, I started asking, why are we burying it? Can we not repurpose it? And in fact, the what's called liquid salt reactors, which can repurpose this fuel into an inert product and create nuclear energy from it. It's been proven back in the 40s and 50s. If they put the $100 million into designing this system, I'm sure they'll get rid of it that way.
There's a lot of questions about those processes and the products that they produce. There's been a proposal floating around in New Brunswick about this, for example, and there are very serious questions about whether it puts us on the wrong side of the Weapons Proliferation Treaty. So that one needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And indeed, even NWMO ruled out fuel reprocessing right off the bat because of the complications associated with it.
I just have a question in regards to, you mentioned distributed power solutions and PPPs, virtual power plants, that I've always been interested in terms of alternatives to expanding nuclear. And I was really, first of all, surprised that they actually moved ahead with Pickering B, because there was, for many years, they're talking about shutting it down and decommissioning it, and then, like you said, a 180-degree switch on that. So that was first surprising, but my comment was just on terms of what is the cost associated with actually, I think it's just how we spend our dollars. So for spending it on nuclear, that's a political decision that we're going down that road, as opposed to spending it on PPPs and looking at the possibilities of using that as a replacement for that energy. There's a lot of stuff going on in the U.S. as far as energy storage, and because it's the question with renewables is the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time. What do you do when it is blowing and it is sunny in terms of storing that energy to be able to use on days when you don't have that energy available to you? And I think VPPs are an excellent solution. What is our government's, where are they with a lot of those solutions?
The short answer is nowhere. I mean, so the Pickering B first, yeah, it was supposed to actually close in 2019, or 2018 actually. And indeed, refurbishing it had been judged uneconomic in 2009. Nuclear power plants don't get better with age. So it would be even less viable. I mean, I would guess minimum 15 billion, probably more, so yeah, probably worse. On the DER virtual power plant thing, the problem is, on one hand, there was this very interesting study done by the IESO itself, which was the first serious study done in Canada on the potential, done by Dunsky and Power Advisory. It's on their website. And they said the findings were very, very substantial in terms of the potential. They basically said that if you don't need to ramp up the gas plant, you don't need to build new gas, for starters, that we could meet the summer peaks and winter peaks through these types of mechanisms. The problem has been it's stuck in what they call a sandbox, like an experimental pilot space. We have local distribution utilities like Electra and others, the LDCs, which are publicly owned distribution companies, basically begging to be allowed to play a role in facilitating this. And the province won't let them. That's the bottom line. And I've argued elsewhere, part of the concern is what they're worried about is that it'll be too successful. And it'll start to erode grid demand, which will undermine the rationale for refurbishing Pickering, Darlington, Bruce, and Newville. That, I I think is a significant consideration in this conversation.
Hello. Thank you for dedicating all your mental energy to this issue because it's so necessary. And you know, it's I'm with Environment North, also we the Nuclear Free North, and all the people in this room agree with everything you've said, and we're all concerned about the climate crisis. So what I don't know if you have an answer to this or advice, but we are working at multiple levels, you know, petitions, there's an e-petition to the federal government, we have reached out to all the municipalities in this region, many First Nations. How do we elevate this to the level, to a national debate? How do we get this to the government? I mean, it sounds like we don't have faith in our institutions, the regulatory body is not functioning. And, you know, we have a Minister of Energy who used to be with Greenpeace. Like, how do we get this issue to be discussed at the level that it needs to be discussed at?
I mean, the short answer, I would say, is partially to quote Dr. Seuss, which is noise, noise, noise. And some of the political leadership and representation clearly is hearing that already. The question is, how do you, I don't have an answer easily, how do you elevate this from what is a regional question in northwestern Ontario into a larger debate inside the province and nationally? You have to be making noise at your representatives across the region, for sure. Absolutely, they have to be hearing that this is becoming a problem. I think the alliance with Indigenous peoples is very, very important because, as I've said, they hold structural power in this conversation in ways that other members of the community do not. And I think it is, you know, there's it's a tough one because I'm struck to the extent partially because we had this 25-year hiatus where we thought this was off the table, and that the nuclear industry was kind of in eternal decline in Canada, and that seemed to be the trajectory we were on. Gentilly was gone, Pickering was going to close. New build was off the table. It's a hard slog to push back and say, well, we're in a different space here, and there's a lot of questions that need to get asked. So I don't have an easy answer on that one. That's the best I can do, because I haven't cracked this either. But this has kind of snuck up on us from behind, and this, in a sense, is though one of the inflection points in the whole situation. Because if they can't solve, thank you. If they can't solve the waste problem, they're in trouble. The whole proposition of nuclear expansion is in trouble, and so I think that's sort of a theme to keep coming back to, and the overriding message from this region that there is not consent. Because that is what the legitimacy of the NWMO's whole project rests on. And they've tied themselves to this willing host thing, and the degree to which the legitimacy of that claim can be challenged, I think is sort of a crucial point in the whole exercise.
I'll maybe just add, I don't know how to add it to the national agenda, but I will say many of the times that I have conversations about nuclear, I don't know how anybody else in this room feels, but it's a bit of a sensitive topic, especially in my hometown, which is close to a research facility, a nuclear research facility where lots of good jobs come from. And even in Toronto, where I'm going to school, again, as I sort of mentioned or alluded to, like a lot of people within environmental institutions have started to believe the narrative of the promise of nuclear for solving the climate crisis. We have to remember that the nuclear industry has put a lot of resources towards this messaging. Even on my street, when I go down it, every subway stop has a poster for nuclear energy. So the best feedback that I've received has been in classrooms, where I know that I have a unique opportunity there, but I sort of see it as planting the seed with 70 students at a time, and then having conversations with people in my community who otherwise wouldn't be having that conversation, and whose mind does start to shift, because when you sort of, again, when you talk about nuclear outside of the narrative of only the energy production, which is what the industry shows everyone, and you instead start talking about some of the consequences of mining and the consequences of siting without consent and the risks of siting, that's what starts to kind of settle in with people, and that's where I start to see maybe a little bit of shift in ideology of things that people don't think about. Because if it's not something that's being proposed in your backyard, it's not something that you have to think about. And so I think maybe starting to have those conversations, and don't need to tell anybody in this room that, but that's what I've been trying to do, at least, but on a national scale. Noise, noise, noise.
If I may, one thing that we're asking people to do locally is to write to the city councilors of Thunder Bay, because we're in negotiation with the Intergovernmental Affairs Association right now to try and get them to adopt, to in some way accept or support the proximity principle with respect to nuclear waste. So if you could write your councilors, thank you. And the petition is passed.
The petition